Hey everyone, welcome back to another video. My name is Vembo, and it's another quiet evening, and I'm back with some more Reddit stories to help you unwind. Just like always, before we get started, I can't believe I'm saying this, but we're almost at 1,000 subscribers. From the bottom of my heart, thank you so much. I've gotten comments from people saying my videos have become part of their night routine, and that truly warms my heart. I've seen a lot of you sharing where you're watching from. So a quick shout out to everyone tuning in from Florida, Saudi Arabia, Australia, and Sweden. It's amazing to see this little community growing from all around the world. No matter what brought you here tonight, whether you're winding down after a long day, struggling with insomnia, or just need some background noise while you focus on other things, I'm really glad you're here with me. I've been getting so many messages from you all about how these videos help you relax and fall asleep. And honestly, that means the world to me. There's something comforting about hearing other people's stories, especially when they're told in that authentic Reddit way, where people just pour their hearts out to strangers on the internet. Tonight I've got a collection of stories that range from heartwarming to mysterious, with a few that might make you think twice about your own relationships and life choices. So get comfortable, maybe dim the lights, and let me share these tales that people felt compelled to share with the world. Let's start with this one. I never thought I'd be the type of person to write one of these posts, but here I am at 3 a.m, unable to sleep, and I need to get this off my chest. My name is David, I'm 28, and for the past 6 months I've been living what I thought was a perfectly normal life with my girlfriend Sarah. We met through mutual friends, hit it off immediately, and things moved pretty naturally from there. She's smart, funny, beautiful, and we seemed to want the same things out of life. But something strange started happening about 2 months ago. I began noticing that Sarah knew things about me that I was certain I'd never told her. Little things at first. She'd mention that I probably needed to pick up more of that specific brand of coffee I like, even though I'd never told her which brand that was. She'd suggest we avoid certain restaurants because she knew I didn't like them. But again, I couldn't remember ever discussing my food preferences in that much detail. At first I thought maybe I was just forgetting conversations we'd had. You know how it is when you're getting comfortable with someone? Sometimes you talk about so many things that they all blur together, but then it started getting more specific. She'd bring up stories from my childhood that I was absolutely certain I'd never shared with anyone, let alone her. She'd reference inside jokes I had with my college roommates, people she'd never met. The breaking point came last week. We were at dinner with my parents, and Sarah started telling this elaborate story about something embarrassing that happened to me in 4th grade. It was incredibly specific, down to the exact words my teacher had said and how red my face had gotten. My parents were laughing and nodding along, clearly remembering the incident. But here's the thing. I had never, ever told Sarah that story. I was certain of it because it was one of those childhood memories that was so mortifying I'd actively avoided thinking about it, let alone sharing it with anyone. After dinner, I pulled Sarah aside and asked her directly how she knew that story. She got this weird look on her face, like she'd been caught doing something wrong, and then she just said she must have heard it from my mum at some point. But I knew that wasn't true, because my mum and Sarah had only met twice before that night, and both times I was present for their entire conversation. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept running through all the little things Sarah had known about me, trying to figure out how she could possibly have that information, and then it hit me, my journal. I've kept a journal since I was in high school, nothing too deep or personal, just a way to process my thoughts and remember important events. I keep it in a drawer in my bedside table, and I write in it maybe once or twice a week. The next morning, after Sarah left for work, I went straight to my bedside table. The journal was exactly where I'd left it, but something felt off. I started flipping through recent entries, and that's when I saw them. Tiny pencil marks in the margins, so faint you could barely see them unless you were looking for them. Someone had been reading my journal and marking their place. I felt sick. I sat there on my bed, holding this journal that contained years of my private thoughts, realizing that Sarah had been systematically going through it and learning intimate details about my life without my knowledge or consent. Every sweet comment about how well she knew me, every thoughtful gesture that seemed to show how compatible we were, it was all based on information she'd stolen from my most private thoughts. But here's where it gets even weirder. I decided to test my theory. That evening, I wrote a completely fake entry about how I'd been thinking about surprising Sarah with a weekend trip to this specific bed and breakfast I'd supposedly been to with an ex-girlfriend. I made up the name of the place, the location, even described the room we'd stayed in. It was all completely fictional, but I wrote it as if it were a real memory I'd been reminiscing about. 3 days later, Sarah casually mentioned that she'd heard about this charming bed and breakfast in the exact location I'd written about, and wouldn't it be romantic if we went there together? She even described details about the place that I'd invented in my fake journal entry. I confronted her that night. I told her I knew she'd been reading my journal, and I explained the test I'd done. Sarah broke down completely. She admitted that she'd been reading it almost since we started dating. She said she'd stumbled across it one morning when she was looking for a phone charger, and she'd read just a little bit out of curiosity. But then she realised how much she was learning about me, about my past, about what I wanted in a relationship. And she couldn't stop. She said she never meant for it to go as far as it did. At first, she just wanted to understand me better, to be the perfect girlfriend. But then she started using the information to seem more compatible with me than she actually was. She'd pretend to share interests that she'd read about in my journal, or avoid topics that she knew were sensitive for me. She said she felt like she was falling in love with me, but she was terrified that the real her wouldn't be enough to keep me interested. The thing is, I could almost understand the initial impulse. Who wouldn't want to know more about someone they're falling for? But this went so far beyond that. She'd been essentially catfishing me, but instead of using fake photos, she was using my own private thoughts to create a false personality that she thought I'd fall in love with. We've been trying to work through it, but I don't know if I can ever trust her again. Every conversation we have, I'm wondering if she's being genuine, or if she's performing based on something she read in my journal. I've started keeping my journal at work, locked in my desk drawer, and that makes me sad because my home used to feel like the one place where I could be completely myself. I guess what I'm struggling with is whether this is something a relationship can recover from. She says she loves the real me and that she wants to start over, to get to know me honestly this time. But how do you unlearn years of someone's private thoughts? How do you separate what you learned naturally from what you learned by violating their privacy? I still care about Sarah, but I feel like I'm dating a stranger who knows all my secrets. And I don't know if that's something we can come back from. That's just, wow. The violation of trust there is staggering, and I can't imagine how disorienting that must have been for him. The fact that she used his own private thoughts against him to manipulate their entire relationship is honestly kind of chilling. Here's another story that caught my attention. I work as a night security guard at a small office complex in the suburbs. It's not glamorous work, but it pays the bills, and usually it's pretty quiet. I mostly just walk around the building a few times each shift, check that doors are locked, and spend the rest of my time reading or watching videos on my phone. The building houses about 6 different small businesses, from a dental practice to a marketing firm to an accounting office. About 3 weeks ago, I started noticing something odd. Every Tuesday night around 2 in the morning, I'd hear classical music coming from the 3rd floor. Not loud, just barely audible, like someone had a radio on low volume. The first time I heard it, I figured maybe someone had left their computer on with music playing, so I went up to investigate. The 3rd floor houses 2 businesses, a law firm and an insurance agency. Both offices were completely dark and locked up tight. I used my master key to check both spaces, but everything was off. No computers running, no radios, nothing that could be producing music. But I could still hear it faintly in the hallway. I spent about 20 minutes trying to track down the source of the music, checking every office, every supply closet, even the bathrooms, nothing. Eventually, the music just stopped on its own, and I went back to my rounds thinking maybe it had been coming from outside the building somehow. But the following Tuesday, same thing. 2 in the morning, classical music from the 3rd floor. This time, I was ready for it. I grabbed my flashlight and headed straight upstairs. The music was definitely coming from inside the building, and it seemed to be strongest near the law firm's office. I unlocked the door and stepped inside. The office was dark and quiet, but I could still hear the music. It sounded like it was coming from the back of the office, near the conference room. I made my way through the reception area, past the individual offices, and toward the conference room at the end of the hall. The music was getting clearer as I got closer. It was definitely classical, maybe Chopin or Debussy, something slow and melancholy. But when I opened the conference room door, the music stopped immediately. Complete silence. I stood there for a few minutes, flashlight scanning the empty room, but there was nothing. No radio, no phone, no computer. Just a long table surrounded by chairs and some law books on a shelf. This pattern continued for weeks. Every Tuesday at 2 in the morning, classical music from the 3rd floor. Every time I investigated, I'd trace it to the law firm's conference room. And every time I opened that door, the music would stop instantly. I started bringing a small recording device with me, thinking maybe I could capture evidence of what was happening, but the recorder never picked up anything. I mentioned it to the day security guard, Marcus, when our shifts overlapped one morning. He gave me this strange look and asked if I'd ever heard about what happened in that conference room about 5 years ago. I said no, so he told me the story. Apparently, there used to be a different law firm in that space. One of the partners, a woman named Elena Vasquez, was working late one Tuesday night, preparing for a big case. She was known for staying in the office until all hours, and she often played classical music while she worked because it helped her concentrate. Around 2 in the morning, she had a massive heart attack in the conference room. She wasn't found until the cleaning crew arrived the next morning. Marcus said Elena's husband had mentioned at the funeral that she'd been working on the most important case of her career that night, something she'd been passionate about for months. She'd apparently told him that she felt like this case could change everything for their firm, maybe even change her entire life. After Marcus told me this story, I started researching Elena Vasquez online. I found her obituary, some articles about the case she'd been working on, even a photo of her from the law firm's old website. She was in her mid-40s, had 2 teenage kids, and by all accounts was dedicated to her work and her clients. The case she died working on was representing a family whose child had been injured by a defective product. She'd been fighting the manufacturer for over a year, and she was finally close to a breakthrough when she died. The case was eventually settled by another attorney, but from what I could find online, the family never got the full justice they were seeking. The settlement was much smaller than what Elena had been pushing for, and the company never had to admit fault or recall the defective product. Now, I'm not usually someone who believes in ghosts or supernatural stuff. I've always been pretty practical about these things, but the timing is just too specific to ignore. Every Tuesday at 2 in the morning, the exact day and time when Elena died, I hear her music playing in the exact room where she spent her final hours. Last Tuesday, I decided to try something different. Instead of immediately investigating the music, I sat down in the hallway outside the law firm and just listened. The music played for almost an hour, the same slow, melancholy, classical pieces. I found myself thinking about Elena, about how she died alone in that conference room, working on a case she'd never get to finish. When the music finally stopped, I stood up and walked to the conference room door, but instead of opening it right away, I knocked softly and said, "Elena, I know about your case. I know you were trying to help that family." Then I opened the door. The room was silent, but something felt different, less heavy maybe. I can't really explain it, but the atmosphere in that space felt more peaceful than it had in weeks. I haven't heard the music since then. It's been 2 Tuesdays now, and the 3rd floor has been completely quiet. Part of me wonders if Elena just needed someone to acknowledge what she'd been trying to do, to recognise that her work mattered, even though she never got to finish it. I'm still not sure if I believe in ghosts, but I do believe that some stories need to be heard, even if the person telling them is no longer around to speak for themselves. That gave me actual chills. There's something so deeply sad about the idea of someone dying while fighting for justice, and then somehow still lingering to continue that fight. Whether you believe in the supernatural or not, the fact that acknowledging her work seemed to bring peace is really moving. I've been married to my husband Jake for 12 years, and I thought I knew everything about him. We met in college, dated for 4 years before getting married, and we've built what I believed was a really solid life together. He's always been the steady, reliable type. Works in IT, loves his routine, never been much for surprises or grand gestures, but he's kind and dependable, and I've always felt secure with him. About 6 months ago, Jake started acting differently. Not in a bad way, just different. He'd always been someone who came home from work, ate dinner, watched TV, and went to bed at the same time every night. But suddenly he was staying up later, sometimes until midnight or even later. When I'd ask what he was doing, he'd say he was just reading or browsing the internet, nothing specific. Then I started noticing other changes. Jake had never been particularly interested in cooking, but he began experimenting with new recipes, making elaborate meals on weekends. He started listening to different music, jazz and blues instead of his usual classic rock. He even bought new clothes, nothing dramatic, just a slightly different style than his usual plain t-shirts and khakis. At first I was happy about these changes. It seemed like Jake was discovering new interests, maybe going through some kind of positive personal growth. But then things started getting more puzzling. He'd reference movies I'd never seen him watch, books I'd never seen him read. He'd make jokes that seemed out of character for him, or use phrases that didn't sound like his usual way of speaking. The thing that really got my attention was when we were at a dinner party with friends, and Jake started telling this story about a hiking trip he'd supposedly taken in college. It was this detailed, funny story about getting lost in the mountains and having to spend the night in a cave. Everyone was laughing, and Jake was so animated telling it, more animated than I'd seen him in years. But here's the thing. I knew Jake in college. We started dating junior year, and I was very familiar with his friend group and his activities. Jake was not a hiker. He'd never mentioned this story before, and I was pretty sure it had never happened. When I asked him about it later, he just shrugged and said maybe he'd never mentioned it because it wasn't that interesting until he thought about it more. This kind of thing kept happening. Jake would tell stories about his past that I'd never heard, express opinions that seemed inconsistent with his usual views, or demonstrate knowledge about subjects he'd never shown interest in before. It was like he was slowly becoming a different person, but in such a gradual way that I couldn't pinpoint exactly when it had started or what was causing it. I began to worry that maybe he was having some kind of mental health crisis, or possibly even early onset dementia, even though he's only 36. I suggested he see a doctor, but he insisted he felt fine, better than he had in years actually. Then about 2 weeks ago, I found out what was really happening. Jake had left his laptop open on the kitchen table, which was unusual because he's normally very careful about closing it when he's not using it. I wasn't trying to snoop, but I could see that he had multiple browser tabs open, and one of them caught my eye because it had a name I didn't recognize. I looked closer and realized that Jake had been reading what appeared to be someone's online journal or blog. The name on the blog was Marcus Chen, and from what I could see, it was incredibly detailed daily entries about this person's life, thoughts, experiences, and memories. I felt weird about looking, but I was so confused about what was happening with Jake that I started reading. Marcus Chen seemed to be about the same age as Jake, but he'd lived a completely different life. He was outgoing, adventurous, had travelled extensively, was passionate about cooking and music and literature. His writing was witty and engaging, and his life experiences were fascinating. As I read more, I started recognising things. The hiking story Jake had told at the dinner party was actually one of Marcus's college memories. The new recipes Jake had been trying were ones Marcus had written about making. Even some of the phrases Jake had been using were things Marcus had written in his journal entries. I realised that Jake had been systematically reading through years of this stranger's online journal and essentially adopting his personality, his memories, his interests, even his sense of humour. It was like Jake was trying to become Marcus Chen. When Jake came home that evening, I confronted him about what I'd found. At first he was defensive, saying it wasn't what it looked like, that he was just reading for entertainment. But eventually he broke down and admitted what had been happening. He said he'd stumbled across Marcus's blog by accident several months ago, and he'd been immediately fascinated by how interesting and engaging Marcus's life seemed compared to his own. Jake said he'd started to feel like his own life was boring and predictable, like he'd never done anything worth remembering or talking about. Reading Marcus's journal entries made him feel like he was experiencing a more exciting life vicariously. But then he started incorporating small things from Marcus's experiences into his own conversations, just to see what it felt like to be someone more interesting. He said it felt good when people responded positively to these stories, when they laughed at Marcus's jokes or seemed impressed by Marcus's experiences. Jake told me he'd never intended for it to go as far as it did, but once he started, he couldn't stop. He said he felt more confident and interesting when he was channeling Marcus's personality than he ever did being himself. The most heartbreaking part was when Jake said he'd been worried that I was getting bored with him, that maybe I regretted marrying someone so ordinary. He thought if he could become more like Marcus, more adventurous and charismatic, I'd be happier in our marriage. I didn't know what to say. Part of me was angry that he'd been essentially lying to me for months, pretending to be someone else. But I was also sad that my husband felt so inadequate that he thought he needed to become a different person to keep me interested. We've been in counselling for the past 2 weeks, trying to work through this. Jake has stopped reading Marcus's blog, and he's been trying to figure out who he actually is underneath all the borrowed personality traits. It's been strange watching him sort through which interests and behaviours are genuinely his and which ones he picked up from Marcus. The therapist says, "This kind of thing is more common than you might think, especially with social media, making it so easy to constantly compare your life to others." She says Jake was essentially experiencing a form of identity crisis, where he felt so disconnected from his own sense of self that he borrowed someone else's. "I love my husband and I want our marriage to work, but I'm struggling with feeling like I don't know who the real Jake is anymore. For months, I was falling in love with this new, more interesting version of him, but now I know that person was essentially a fiction based on a stranger's life." Jake is working on rediscovering his own interests and passions, things that are genuinely his rather than borrowed from Marcus Chen. It's been like watching him grow up all over again, figuring out what he actually likes and who he wants to be. I guess what I'm learning is that loving someone means accepting them as they actually are, not as they think they need to be to keep you interested. And Jake is learning that being ordinary isn't the same thing as being worthless, that his quiet, steady personality has value even if it doesn't make for exciting dinner party stories. That story really hits differently because it touches on something so many people struggle with, feeling like their own life isn't interesting enough compared to what they see others living. The fact that Jake felt he needed to become someone else entirely to keep his wife's love is heartbreaking. It shows how social media and constant comparison can really mess with our sense of self-worth. Let me continue with another one that really made me think about the lengths people will go to protect the ones they love. My grandmother died 3 years ago, and I inherited her house along with all the belongings she'd accumulated over 86 years of life. It's a beautiful old Victorian in a quiet neighbourhood, the kind of place where everyone knows each other and kids still ride their bikes until the streetlights come on. I'd always loved visiting her there as a child, but living in it as an adult has been a completely different experience. The house came with everything exactly as she'd left it. Her clothes still hanging in the closets, her books arranged just so on the shelves, even her reading glasses sitting on the nightstand next to a half-finished crossword puzzle. My family kept telling me I should go through everything and donate what I didn't want, but I couldn't bring myself to disturb her things. It felt too much like erasing her, so I just moved my own belongings into the spare bedroom and left everything else untouched. I told myself I'd deal with it eventually, but months turned into years, and I found myself living like a guest in my own home, careful not to disturb the life my grandmother had left behind. About 6 months ago, I decided it was finally time to start going through her things. I began with the basement, figuring that would be the least emotionally challenging place to start. Most of it was what you'd expect: holiday decorations, old furniture, boxes of photographs and documents. But in the far corner, behind a stack of Christmas tree boxes, I found something that stopped me cold. There was a small wooden chest, about the size of a shoebox, with a brass nameplate that read, Thomas Mitchell, 1943-1967. I'd never heard my grandmother mention anyone named Thomas Mitchell, and the date suggested he'd died very young. Inside the chest were dozens of letters, all addressed to my grandmother, all signed, "With all my love, Tommy." The letters were love letters, written in the careful handwriting of someone who wasn't used to expressing deep emotions on paper. They talked about missing her, about counting the days until he could see her again, about dreams they shared for their future together. The earliest letters were postmarked 1962, when my grandmother would have been 19. The latest was dated December 1967. This was confusing because I knew my grandmother had married my grandfather in 1963, and they'd been married until his death in 1998. According to family history, my grandparents had been high school sweethearts who'd never been with anyone else. But here was evidence of this intense relationship with someone named Tommy that had apparently lasted for years, even overlapping with her marriage. I spent hours reading through the letters, trying to piece together the story. Tommy was clearly deeply in love with my grandmother, and from the tone of her letters that he referenced, it seemed like she felt the same way. He wrote about places they'd been together, inside jokes they shared, plans they were making. But there was also an undercurrent of sadness, references to obstacles they were facing, and reasons they couldn't be together openly. In one of the later letters, Tommy wrote about how he understood why she'd had to marry Richard. That was my grandfather's name, but that he'd wait for her as long as it took. He said he knew she didn't love Richard the way she loved him, and that someday they'd find a way to be together properly. The final letter, dated December 15th, 1967, was different from the others. Tommy wrote that he'd been drafted and was shipping out to Vietnam in 2 weeks. He said he was scared, not of dying, but of never seeing her again. He asked her to wait for him, promised he'd come back to her, and said that thinking of their future together was the only thing giving him strength to face what was ahead. That was the last letter in the box. I looked up Thomas Mitchell online and found his name on the Vietnam Veterans Memorial. He'd died in combat in February 1968, just 2 months after writing that final letter to my grandmother. I sat in that basement for hours, holding these letters and trying to reconcile this story with everything I thought I knew about my grandmother. She'd been married to my grandfather for 35 years, had raised 4 children with him, and by all accounts had been a devoted wife and mother. But here was evidence of this great love affair that had shaped her entire young adult life. I found myself looking at old family photos with new eyes. There were pictures of my grandmother from the late 60s and early 70s, where she looked sad in a way I'd never noticed before. Even in happy family moments, there was something distant in her expression. Like part of her was somewhere else. I decided to ask my mother about Tommy Mitchell. I didn't mention the letters at first, just casually brought up whether Grandma had ever talked about her life before Grandpa. My mother said that Grandma had always been very private about her past, that she'd focused entirely on her family and rarely talked about her younger days. But then my mother said something that made my heart stop. She said that every year, on February 20th, my grandmother would get very quiet and spend the day alone in her room. She'd tell the family she wasn't feeling well and didn't want to be disturbed. My mother had always assumed it was just one of those days when older people feel under the weather, but looking back, she realised it happened every single year on the same date. I looked back at the information I'd found about Thomas Mitchell. He died on February 20th, 1968. For 50 years, my grandmother had spent the anniversary of Tommy's death in private mourning, and no one in the family had ever known why. She'd carried this grief alone, this love story that no one else knew about, while building a life with someone else. I found myself wondering what my grandmother's life would have been like if Tommy had come home from Vietnam. Would she have left my grandfather? Would my mother and her siblings ever have been born? It felt strange to realise that my entire family's existence might have been contingent on this tragic twist of fate. The more I thought about it, the more I understood why my grandmother had married my grandfather when she was clearly in love with someone else. In 1963, a 19-year-old woman didn't have many options for independence. Marriage was security, respectability, a path to adulthood that didn't require family approval of her romantic choices. Maybe marrying Richard was the only way she could maintain her relationship with Tommy without scandal. But I also wondered about my grandfather. Had he known about Tommy? Had he spent 35 years married to a woman whose heart belonged to someone else? Or had my grandmother genuinely learned to love him over time, building a different kind of love on top of the foundation of her first great romance? I decided not to tell the rest of my family about the letters. My grandmother had kept this secret for 50 years, and it felt wrong to expose it now that she wasn't here to explain her choices. But I did keep the letters. I moved them upstairs to her bedroom, placing them in the drawer of her nightstand next to her reading glasses. Sometimes I sit in her room and think about the complexity of human hearts, how we can love multiple people in different ways throughout our lives, how the paths we don't take can shape us just as much as the ones we do. My grandmother built a good life with my grandfather, raised children who adored her, and was genuinely happy in many ways. But she also carried this profound love and loss with her every single day. I think what strikes me most is how she honoured both loves in her own way. She was a devoted wife to my grandfather, but she also never forgot Tommy Mitchell. She found a way to hold space in her heart for both relationships, without diminishing either one. I still live in her house, but now I understand it differently. It's not just the place where my grandmother lived with my grandfather and raised her family. It's also the place where she kept her letters from Tommy, where she spent 50 years of February 20th remembering a love that war had stolen from her. And somehow, knowing this secret makes me feel closer to her than I ever did when she was alive. She wasn't just my sweet grandmother who baked cookies and taught me to knit. She was a woman who'd experienced profound love and devastating loss, who'd made impossible choices and lived with their consequences, who'd carried someone else's memory in her heart for decades without ever letting it make her bitter. The depth of love and loss in that story is just overwhelming. The idea that she quietly mourned Tommy every year for 50 years while building a completely different life is both heartbreaking and beautiful. It really makes you think about all the secret histories people carry with them. Here's something completely different that showed up in my feed. I work as a therapist specialising in couples counselling, and I've been doing this for about 15 years now. You'd think after all this time, nothing would surprise me anymore. But last month I had a session that left me questioning everything I thought I knew about relationships and honesty. A couple came to see me, let's call them Mark and Jennifer, who'd been married for 8 years. They seemed like a pretty typical middle-class couple in their 30s, both working professional jobs, no kids yet, but talking about it. They'd come to therapy because Jennifer felt like Mark had become distant and secretive over the past year, and she was worried he might be having an affair. Mark insisted he wasn't cheating, but he admitted he'd been keeping something from Jennifer that he was afraid would ruin their marriage if she found out. During our first session, he was visibly anxious, sweating, barely able to make eye contact with either of us. Jennifer was frustrated and hurt, convinced that whatever he was hiding had to be another woman. I spent several sessions trying to create a safe space for Mark to share whatever he was struggling with. I've worked with people hiding all kinds of things: affairs, addictions, financial problems, family secrets. I thought I'd heard it all. But when Mark finally opened up, his secret was unlike anything I'd encountered in my practice. For the past 18 months, Mark had been living a completely double life, but not in the way you might think. He wasn't having an affair or maintaining a secret family. Instead, he'd been pretending to go to work every day, while actually spending his time volunteering at a local homeless shelter and food bank. Here's what had happened. Mark had been laid off from his marketing job about 1.5 years ago. The company downsized, and despite his good performance, he was let go along with about 30% of the staff. He was devastated, not just because of the financial impact, but because he'd really identified with his career and felt like losing his job meant losing part of himself. He applied for unemployment benefits and started job hunting, but he couldn't bring himself to tell Jennifer what had happened. She'd been so proud of his recent promotion, had been bragging to her friends and family about his success. He was terrified that she'd see him as a failure, that she'd lose respect for him, or start to question whether he could provide for the family they were planning to start. So Mark made a decision that seemed logical to him at the time. He'd pretend to still be going to work every day while he looked for a new job, and once he found something, he'd tell Jennifer about the brief period of unemployment after the fact, maybe even spin it as a positive career move. The problem was finding a new job turned out to be much harder than Mark had anticipated. Weeks turned into months, and he was still getting up every morning, putting on his work clothes and leaving the house at his usual time. But instead of going to an office, he'd spend the day at coffee shops, libraries and parks, applying for jobs and trying to figure out how to explain his growing deception to his wife. After about 6 months of this, Mark was becoming increasingly depressed and anxious. He'd burned through most of their savings, covering his share of expenses, all while Jennifer thought he was bringing home his regular salary. He felt trapped in a lie that was getting bigger every day, but he couldn't see a way out that wouldn't destroy his marriage. That's when he started volunteering at the homeless shelter. He said it began almost by accident. He was sitting in a park near downtown, feeling sorry for himself, when he noticed a line of people waiting outside a building across the street. He asked someone what was happening, and they told him it was a soup kitchen that served lunch every day. Mark said something about seeing those people, many of whom were struggling with their own job loss and financial problems, put his situation into perspective. He realized that while his pride was hurt and his marriage was strained, he still had a home, health insurance, through Jennifer's job and people who loved him. He decided to start volunteering, initially just to fill his days with something meaningful, while he continued job hunting. But what started as a way to pass time became the most fulfilling work Mark had ever done. He discovered that he was good at connecting with people who were struggling, that his own experience with job loss and financial anxiety gave him empathy for what the shelter clients were going through. The staff started relying on him more and more, eventually offering him a paid position as a program coordinator. The salary was about 60% of what he'd been making in marketing, but Mark found the work infinitely more rewarding. For the first time in his adult life, he felt like he was making a real difference in people's lives rather than just pushing products or managing campaigns. But he still couldn't figure out how to tell Jennifer the truth. By this point, he'd been lying for over a year. He'd have to admit not only that he'd lost his job, but that he'd been deceiving her every single day for months. He'd have to explain the financial situation, the new job that paid significantly less, and the fact that their entire relationship had been built on a massive lie for the past 1.5 years. So Mark continued the deception, leaving for his job at the shelter every morning and coming home every evening, letting Jennifer believe he was still working in marketing. He said the stress of maintaining the lie was eating him alive, but he felt like he was in too deep to come clean without losing everything. Jennifer, meanwhile, had started noticing changes in Mark's behaviour and assumed the worst. He was anxious and distant. He seemed to be struggling financially, despite supposedly having a good job, and he'd become secretive about his daily activities. All of these things looked like classic signs of an affair to her, which is why she'd insisted they come to therapy. When Mark finally told this story in our session, Jennifer's reaction was unlike anything I'd seen before. She didn't get angry about the deception, at least not initially. Instead, she was completely confused. She kept asking questions like, "But why didn't you just tell me you lost your job? And why would you think I'd leave you over something like that?" It turned out that Jennifer had been laid off herself early in their relationship, and Mark had been incredibly supportive during her job search. She'd never understood why he thought she'd react differently if the situation were reversed. She was hurt by the lying, but she was even more hurt by the fact that Mark had so little faith in their relationship that he thought she'd abandon him over job loss. The financial deception was more serious. Mark had been covering his share of expenses by liquidating his retirement account and taking cash advances on credit cards, all without Jennifer's knowledge. They were in significantly more debt than she'd realised, and some of the financial goals they'd been planning, like buying a house or starting a family, would need to be postponed. But the thing that surprised me most was Jennifer's reaction to Mark's new job. When he explained what he'd been doing at the shelter, how much the work meant to him, and how good he was at it, she started crying. She said she'd been wondering for years why Mark seemed so unfulfilled by his marketing career, and that seeing him talk about his work with homeless clients was the most passionate she'd ever seen him. Jennifer said she'd rather have a husband who made less money doing work he loved than one who was miserable in a high-paying job. She was angry about the deception, but she was also proud of him for finding work that mattered to him, even if he'd gone about it in the most complicated way possible. We spent several more sessions working through the trust issues and the financial planning. But what struck me was how this couple's biggest crisis had actually revealed something beautiful about their relationship. Mark's fear of being judged had nearly destroyed their marriage, but Jennifer's actual response showed a level of love and support that he'd never fully believed in. Mark has continued working at the shelter, and Jennifer has taken a part-time consulting gig to help with their finances while they pay down the debt from Mark's period of deception. They're planning to start a family next year, and they seem stronger than they were before this crisis. I think about this case a lot because it illustrates how our fears about our partner's reactions can sometimes be much worse than the reality. Mark spent 18 months living in terror of Jennifer's judgment, creating an elaborate deception that nearly destroyed their marriage, when the truth was that she would have supported him through his job loss and celebrated his career change. It also made me think about how many people might be living with unnecessary shame about their circumstances, afraid to be vulnerable with the people who love them most. Sometimes the stories we tell ourselves about how others see us are much harsher than the reality of how they actually feel. That's such a powerful reminder that the stories we create in our heads about how people will react are often so much worse than reality. Mark put himself through 18 months of hell because he was afraid of a conversation that probably would have brought them closer together from the start. Let me share one more story that really stayed with me. I've been working as a night nurse at a large hospital for about 7 years now. It's demanding work, but I love the quieter pace of the night shift and the close relationships you develop with patients who are staying for extended periods. You become part of people's lives during some of their most vulnerable moments, and there's something really meaningful about being there for them when they need it most. About 2 months ago, we had a patient admitted to our floor who immediately stood out to me. His name was Robert. He was in his 70s and he'd been brought in with complications from diabetes that had gotten out of control. He was going to need to stay for at least a week while we stabilised his blood sugar and adjusted his medications. What made Robert unusual wasn't his medical condition, but his visitor situation. Every single night, without fail, a different woman would come to see him during visiting hours. They were all roughly his age, all well-dressed and articulate, and they all seemed to know him very well. They'd sit by his bed for hours, talking and laughing, bringing him books and flowers and homemade food. At first I assumed these were family members, maybe sisters or cousins, but as I listened to their conversations while doing my rounds, I realised that wasn't the case. These women all talked to Robert like he was someone very special to them, someone they cared about deeply in a romantic way. By the end of his first week, I'd counted 7 different women who'd come to visit Robert. They never overlapped, like someone was coordinating their schedules, and they all brought the same kind of loving, attentive energy to their visits. I found myself fascinated by this mystery. Robert himself was charming and articulate, the kind of older gentleman who had stories about everything and could make anyone laugh. He was always polite to the staff, patient with the medical procedures, and genuinely seemed to enjoy his conversations with his visitors. But I noticed he was always a little vague when I asked about his family or his living situation. One night, curiosity got the better of me, and I asked Robert directly about his visitors. I said something casual like, "You're so lucky to have so many people who care about you," hoping he'd explain the situation. Robert got this twinkle in his eye and said, "Nurse Sarah, I've been very fortunate in love." Then he asked if I had a few minutes to sit down, because he had a story he thought I might find interesting. It turns out that Robert had never been married, not in the traditional sense, but over the past 40 years, he'd been in committed, loving relationships with 7 different women, and they all knew about each other. Robert explained that he'd always been upfront about his unconventional approach to relationships. He said he'd never felt capable of the kind of exclusive, monogamous love that marriage typically requires, but he was capable of deep, lasting love with multiple people. He'd always been honest about this with the women he dated, and over the years, he'd found 7 remarkable women who were willing to share his love rather than demand all of it. He said it wasn't like he was juggling secret affairs or deceiving anyone. All 7 women knew about the others, and they'd actually become friends over the years. They coordinated holidays and birthdays, they supported each other through difficult times, and they'd created this extended family of choice that worked for all of them. Robert told me that each relationship was unique and meaningful. He loved different things about each woman, spent different kinds of time with each of them, and felt like his life was incredibly rich because of these varied connections. He said some people might think it was selfish or unusual, but that everyone involved was happy with the arrangement. What really surprised me was when he mentioned that several of the women had other relationships too. It wasn't like they were all sitting around waiting for their turn with Robert. Some of them were married, some had other partners, and some were single by choice. They'd all found ways to make space in their lives for their connection with Robert, while still pursuing other forms of love and companionship. As Robert was telling me this story, I found myself thinking about how different his life was from anything I'd ever encountered, but also how happy and fulfilled he seemed. Here was a man in his 70s who had 7 people who loved him enough to take turns visiting him in the hospital, who'd built these lasting relationships based on honesty and mutual respect. The next night, I happened to be working when 2 of Robert's visitors arrived at the same time. I was curious to see how they'd handle the overlap, whether there would be awkwardness or jealousy. But instead, they greeted each other warmly, like old friends, and spent the visit talking together with Robert, like they were all part of the same family. I watched them interact and realised that what Robert had described wasn't just theoretical. These women genuinely cared about each other, not just about him. They'd created this network of relationships that extended beyond their individual connections with Robert. Before Robert was discharged, one of his visitors, a woman named Margaret, stayed after hours to talk with me. She said she'd noticed my curiosity about their situation and wanted to make sure I understood that it wasn't as unusual as it might seem. Margaret explained that she'd been married for 30 years to a man she loved deeply, but that her relationship with Robert fulfilled different emotional needs. Her husband knew about Robert and was supportive of their connection, just as Margaret supported her husband's close friendships with other women. She said that society teaches us to expect one person to meet all of our emotional needs, but that she'd found it healthier and more realistic to have different relationships that served different purposes. Robert was her intellectual companion, the person she talked to about books and philosophy and ideas. Her husband was her life partner, the person she shared daily routines and practical decisions with. Margaret said that having Robert in her life had actually made her marriage stronger because she wasn't putting pressure on her husband to be everything to her. She felt more fulfilled and balanced, which made her a better partner in all of her relationships. I've been thinking about Robert and his 7 women for weeks now. I'm not sure if I could live that way myself. I think I'm probably too traditional in my approach to relationships. But there was something beautiful about the way they'd all chosen to love each other, the way they'd rejected social expectations in favour of something that actually worked for them. It made me question some of my assumptions about what relationships are supposed to look like, about whether the traditional model of exclusive partnership is really the only way to build a meaningful life with other people. Robert seemed genuinely happy, and so did all of his visitors. They'd found a way to love that worked for them, even if it wouldn't work for most people. When Robert was discharged, all 7 women came to say goodbye. They brought a card they'd all signed, and a photo of the group of them from some celebration they'd shared. Robert cried when he saw them all together, and he told them they were the greatest blessing of his life. I think what struck me most was how intentional their approach to love was. They hadn't just fallen into this arrangement by accident. They'd all made conscious choices about how they wanted to love and be loved, and they'd been brave enough to create something that worked for them instead of settling for something that didn't. That's all I have for tonight's collection of stories. Each one of these tales reminds me that people are living incredibly complex, beautiful, and sometimes surprising lives all around us. If you're still with me and these stories helped you unwind or gave you something to think about, I'd really appreciate it if you'd consider subscribing. It helps me know that this little corner of the internet is serving its purpose. Sweet dreams, everyone.